Matthew chapter 13, the parable of the sower and the seeds. Now, this is one of those sections in the gospel in which you have a story that is somewhat interrupted by another section. It's not interrupted. In the midst of the parable, Jesus gives from verses 9 to 17, he talks about why he speaks in parables. So what I want to do is I want to move that to next week. Next week, we will discuss the nature of parables. And tonight, we're going to discuss the actual parable of the sower and the seed. So in other words, what we're going to look at is verses 1 through 8 of Matthew 13. Matthew 13, 1 through 8, and then 18 through 23. 1 through 8 is when he tells the parable, and then 18 through 23 is when he explains the parable. George Whitefield was one of the great evangelists in church history. And George Whitefield was once asked the question, how many people in his ministry had accepted Christ? Or he once preached rather at a large meeting, and many people responded, and he was asked, how many people tonight accepted Christ? And he said, quote, "We'll see in a few years." And what struck me about that is, first of all, it's very different than the bold pronouncements I get on these revivalist flyers I get in the mail, Dale, where, you open this flyer and it's like, last Tuesday night, 8,000 people entered the kingdom of heaven. And I rejoiced at that. And I'm not trying to be uncharitable, but my point is, we'll see in a few years is actually more accurate. Billy Graham used to talk about this. The percentage of people in his crusades, A, who walked the aisle, B, who actually showed some evidence sometimes later of being a believer. My point also isn't that, you have to somehow earn. Look, if you sincerely call on the name of Christ, you're saved. But the point of Whitefield's statement, we'll see in a few years, is this, that not all who profess to have received Christ have actually taken hold of Christ. And we all know that. Jesus says this earlier in Matthew, not all who say to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. And he says it here in the parable. One of the points of the parable of the sower and the seeds is that oftentimes there is an appearance of the seed having been successfully sowed that does not bear closer examination. And so this is a famous parable. I love this parable, as do I hope all of you guys. I think you do. And I just want to unpack it. Just two basic points. I want to talk about the movement of the sowing, and I want to talk about the soils and their results. First of all, if you look at the parable of the sower and the seeds in Matthew 13, there's four basic movements. Four basic movements. Number one, seed is sown. Number two, the seed is received onto some type of soil. Number three, the seed meets the soil rather. And number four, the soil either sustains or rejects the seed. I'm going to reduce this to 3 points. The two and third, as I read this now, seem like the same point. So number one, seed is sown. Number two, seed meets soil. Number three, soil either sustains or rejects the seed. So what I want to do in this first point is just define some terms. If you read the parable, you get a pretty good definition of certain images. First of all, what is the seed? It's the parable of a sower sowing seed, like a farmer who goes out. And there were two ways they did this. You could either sow seed by hand, which in a lot of the artwork, that's it because it's more dramatic. You know what I mean? These paintings of the parable, the guy's throwing the seed out, which is very common. Or sometimes they would, take the bag of seed and puncture it and just walk so that the seed kind of fell out. What is the seed? Jesus tells us in 4 different verses what the seed is. One of the references is very specific, and the other 3 are more general references to that. So the most specific is in verse 19, where he says the seed is the word of the kingdom. The word of the kingdom. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom. And then in verses 20, 22, and 23, it's referred to as the word. So the seed that is sown is the word of the kingdom. And I want to just argue that the word of the kingdom is the gospel. It's the message of salvation. It's the message of the kingdom. The message of the kingdom is the message of the gospel because it's the message, A, of the king, and B, of how we can enter into service to the King through faith, that we can be saved and become part of the kingdom of God. So the seed is the word of the kingdom. Number two, movement number two, seed meets soil. We're going to see that once we receive the seed, it is received onto a certain type of soil. Now, we receive the seed, we are told repeatedly, by hearing. The word hearing is used over and over and over again. It's used in verse 18, by the way, when he says, hear then the parable. But it's also used in 19, 20, 22, and 23. So the seed is the word of the kingdom. It is received through hearing. It meets soil. What is the soil? The soil is the inner condition of the heart. And that soil either sustains or rejects the seed. It either receives it, appears to receive it, or it's ultimately rejected by it. In verse 19, the soil is likened to the heart, and in verse 21, it's likened to the inner condition of humanity in us. If you look at verse 21, yet he has no root in himself. So now we get just a sense of our bearings. The sower sows the seed. The seed is the word of the kingdom. It is sown by means of our hearing it and receiving it. We receive it into the soil that is our heart. And the condition of our heart is ultimately revealed in how the seed is either accepted or rejected. So he's going to give us examples of soil that is deficient and one example of soil that is right and good. So let's talk about that in the second point, the soils and their results. There are four basic soils, okay? The seed is sown in four different ways, and there are four different results, and we have four different interpretations. Number one, verse 4. Verse 4, verse 3, let's start with that. He told them many things in parables, saying, a sower went out to sow. Then verse 4, as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. That's number one, seeds that fall along the path. Number two, other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched. Since they had no root, they withered away. Number three, verse 7, other seeds fell among thorns. The thorns grew up and choked them. And number 4, verse 8, other seeds fell on good soil and produced good grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears, let him hear. So we have four sowings, if you will. It's sown on the path or along the path. It's sown on rocky ground. It's sown among thorns, and it's sown on good soil. There are four results. The seed that is sown on the path is devoured by birds. The seed that is sown on rocky ground grows up quickly and then is scorched by the sun. And then the seeds that are sown among thorns, we're told that the thorns grow up and choke out the growth. And then the seed that is on good soil grows and brings about great results. Jesus then interprets the four sowings and the four results. Verse 19, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, this is the seed along the path. The evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. So the evil one there is likened to the birds that snatch up the seed that fell along the path. So, seed that is sown along the path, devoured by birds, that is ignorance. They do not understand, and Satan attacks, the birds devour it. Look at verses 20 and 21 to see the results of seed on rocky ground. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, which is interesting because that means there's an immediate emotional response to their hearing of the word. Yet, he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away. So the interpretation of the seed that is sown on rocky ground is that it grows quick, but it has no roots and it cannot sustain itself. Persecution and trials come and the person falls away. The third, seed among the thorns, is interpreted in verse 22. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. So, those among the thorns grow up and choke it, and it doesn't bear fruit. He defines specifically what the thorns are. The cares of the world, which are maybe spiritually neutral things. These are it's just living life, right? But life gets in the way. But then the second one is not so spiritually neutral. It's a negative phrase, the deceitfulness of riches. These choke out the word, and that person proves unfruitful. And then lastly, in the kind of just giving an overview here in our second point, the seed that falls on good soil and that grows is interpreted in verse 23. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it. He indeed bears fruit and yields. In one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. And that's really interesting because, for one thing, it tells us that part of receiving the word effectively is to receive it with understanding. But that can't be interpreted just as cognition, as mentally grasping it. The demons, we are told by James, mentally understand the gospel. Understanding there means an open heart that receives it and understands the full impact of it. Notice, secondly, not only is understanding a part of bearing fruit, but notice too that there are people, we have different places along the path. Some, we are told, some bear 100-fold, another 60-fold, and another 30-fold. Craig Keener has done a good job of pointing out something about these numbers. He writes 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold are tremendously good harvests from Galilean soil. The Jordan Valley normally yielded between 10 and 100-fold, but for much of Palestine, the average yield was 10-fold, meaning that 10 seeds were harvested for every seed sown. And all the figures Jesus reports here are very, very good yields. So Jesus is not saying some of my followers will be useful and some of them will be useless. I mean, all the images here are of fruitful, fruit-bearing, good followers of Christ, that he's going to do great things. But some will bear 100, some 60, and another 30. You know, there may be times in your life when you bore more fruit for Christ than other times. There may be times when you walked with him more closely and just saw him do great, great things. I want to just press a couple of things here, and then I want to talk about this a little bit. First of all, I want to just return to this idea of hearing. It's usually said that the sower, properly understood, is Jesus, and I think that's correct. The sower is Christ, and he comes into the world. In the context here, Jesus is being opposed for his teaching. I mean, he's been proclaiming the kingdom, and all of this is happening. However, the church is the body of Christ, and so it is the privilege and the responsibility of the church to proclaim. We are now one of the ways that people hear the gospel. I say one of because I don't believe God is out of the business of directly speaking the gospel to people himself where the church is not present. And I say that because I have heard too many of our missionaries in Muslim places talking about going to villages and encountering people who have had vivid dreams of the Jesus they've never heard of before. Can God still directly sow seed into the hearts and minds of people before the church even shows up on the scene? He can. It's miraculous. The normal method, if there's anything can be called normal, is for God to get the seed to the world through the church. And so we see this beautifully in Romans 10:14. How then will they call on him on whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him on whom they have... And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? How's that? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? How are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. And then he says in verse 17, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of God. I think that's important because, as I mentioned, 5 times hearing is mentioned in the parable of the sower of the seed. Properly understood, biblical hearing that bears fruit is faithful hearing. It's not just mechanical and auditory. He's not just saying, if they hear the words. No, just as understanding is more than cognition, hearing is more than your physical ears. He's saying, hear in faith. That's what Paul says. Faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. If you have ever been around kids or young people or have kids, you know what I'm talking about. It is possible for them to physically hear you, but not hear you. We have teachers in our midst. Y'all know what I'm talking about. We have grandparents in our midst. We have parents in our midst. You know perfectly well that someone can hear you without having heard you. Chuck Swindoll said once that he went home and his daughter was just telling him all about her day, and he kind of was like, reading the paper, And he said his little girl reached up and got his face and turned it and said, listen with your face. And I think that's the hearing of good soil, that you have really connected with the message of the kingdom and received it. So first of all, I just want to say, we are privileged to be part of the sowing task, but on the other end of it, hearing that leads to fruit that receives the seed of the kingdom on good soil is the hearing of faith, as Paul puts it. Faith comes from hearing through the word of Christ. And I secondly want to say this. Jesus is getting to brass tacks here. He's done this in numerous different ways already. What really matters is the condition of the heart. I mean, you ever come to church, you hear everything that everyone else hears, but you know your heart's far, far away, or your mind. I have. Ask me if I've, don't, but ask me if I've ever preached a sermon and my heart was far away. Yeah. Look, there's tons of preachers who preach every Sunday and then all of a sudden just implode on a Monday. You're like, didn't you preach yesterday? Yeah, but preaching doesn't mean you're grasping what you're preaching. By the way, there are stories of people who have been converted under their own preaching in Christian history. Lost people who thought they were called to preach, who preach the gospel, and then they finally hear it while they're preaching it and get convicted and accept Christ. It's a very famous episode. I bet you Dale will probably remember it. But there are cases of that in Christian history. So the condition of the heart is what matters here. Martin Lloyd-Jones said this, and he said this, by the way, in a book I cannot recommend highly enough, Spiritual Depression. Martin Lloyd-Jones was a medical doctor before he was a preacher, the great British preacher. And he wrote a book on depression way back before people were writing books popularly and commonly on depression. And it's powerful. I've given it to a lot of folks in counseling. He says this, I am suggesting that this is the case with large numbers of people. They have assumed that they are right about the first things, but they never have been right about their justification. And it is just here that the devil causes confusion. It suits him well, the devil, that such people should be concerned about sanctification. Why aren't I growing? And holiness and various other things, but they can never be right until they are right here. And that is why we must start with this. It is no use going on to deal with the superstructure if the foundation is not right. So I would just point this out to all of us. that you can see some growth and wonder why you're not growing, but you can convince yourself you're growing when the seed's never really taken root. And I say this carefully because I don't like preachers that are constantly making people doubt their salvation. Today, I'll put this in a very general sense. Today, a person was in my office sharing that they are struggling to rest in their salvation. Am I saved? How do I know I'm saved? And so we started at the very beginning. I asked the person, who is Jesus? What is sin? What is the cross? Tell me what the gospel is. And the person answered beautifully, with great feeling. And have you called on the name of Christ? I have. I believe in him. I've called. I love him. I've called on him. So what I don't like taking something like that and saying, well, you're probably lost. The devil attacks our assurance of salvation. On the other hand, there's a time to comfort people who are saved and are struggling with it. There's a time to convict people who aren't saved and think they are. And that requires just a certain degree of discernment. So to ask yourself this, what fruit is the seed bearing in the soil of your heart? If you were to judge your own heart, not your neighbor's, but if we were to judge our hearts on the basis of the fruit of the seed that we claim to have received, what would we conclude about our hearts? And thirdly, has your heart truly received the seed of the kingdom, the seed of the gospel in faith? If you do, you will see movement. I don't mean that every moment is the Super Bowl. It's not. There are dark valleys sometimes to walk through where you can't see the growth. But I mean that overall, you will know that God is doing a work in and of your life. And it may be 100, another 60, and another 30, but he will be doing something in and through your life. So I'm excited about this conversation because there's such rich stuff here. And I want to talk about this. And I want you to talk with me about the soil of the heart, the seed of the gospel, and the different ways that it can either flourish or be squelched on the basis of our own hearts.